Hello, welcome to DeHavilland's latest live stream. Today we're talking everything trade. And then speaking with us are Ali Renison, who is Head of EU and Trade Policy at the Institute of Directors. We also have with us James Sibley, formerly of this parish, now Deputy Head of EU and International Affairs at the FSB. Welcome to you both.
Hello.
I'm John McStravick. I'll be leading things. So let's kick off with the trade bill. At the time of recording, it is being debated in Parliament. Let's start with you, Ali. Looking at the trade bill, are there any things that particularly stand out for you or which your members at the IOD are watching particularly closely?
I think the people who are probably watching it the most closely are probably people who are in the agri-food space, because there was obviously a lot of noise in the last few days, past week, over sort of a number of similar amendments aimed at basically trying to entrench into law protection for a certain level of standards. Now that became rather difficult because obviously it potentially had implications for our trade negotiations, not only with the US, but with the EU. The government was very much of the view that this would hamper its ability to have as much flexibility as I suppose it wanted to. And I suppose you could make the same argument that that is clearly in its approach to EU negotiations, that there is a priority on not agreeing to things that constrain the UK's ability going forward. And I think the big issue about there is that it's not so much, if you look at it just purely on the agri-food basis and the farmers' concerns, it's not so much that they don't think that the government doesn't want to protect the standards, but they want it put into law. And then, you know, if you're looking at it from a WTO's perspective, or people who I know who work at the WTO, they were looking at these amendments and saying, well, actually, this is, they wouldn't say it sort of breached WTO trade rules or anything, but they were saying this is going to potentially put, your partners are going to be looking at this when you negotiate. So I think that's probably been the most controversial part of it from a business perspective. Most other businesses outside of the sort of farming and parts of the agri-food space, I don't think it's completely high up on their agenda. They see this largely for what I think the government wants it to be, which is a piece of legislation that tries to set out the necessary requirements to be able to act as an independent country outside of the EU, so to speak. That was the argument around the ability to put the anti-dumping new sort of regime into place. So I think that's how a lot of people are looking at the trade bill. I think the only other really controversial part of it at a political level, less so a business and trade level, is the fact that you have a constitutional ratification process. And that's clearly become a big political issue in and of itself, because we are relying on a pre-existing, they call it the Craig provisions for passing through ratification of international treaties, and trade deals form part of that. But obviously, because the UK is now going to be doing this themselves rather than the EU, there is a big argument with other parties of the opposition, because they want a brand new ratification process that involves MPs more directly.
How do we think that might play out? So do we know yet what the new, the Labour Party under a new leadership thinks on these sorts of measures? Obviously, Keir Starmer, when he was Shadow Brexit Secretary rather than leader, followed trade indirectly very closely. What do we think the leadership of the Labour Party might be pushing on? And also, it's quite interesting that some Conservative backbenchers have, 24 of them writing to the Conservative leadership, saying that they've got some issues as well.
Yes, I mean, it's interesting on that last point, just to sort of do it in reverse. If anyone has gone to any of the party conferences and you go to the fringe events, you really see the split in party membership opinion there. You don't see it out on the front stage. And I think the Conservative Party conference, to your point, is no exception in that respect. It was always interesting, while they didn't get as much fanfare, certainly before Brexit, you would see these debates playing out between, I think what some people call the sort of Shire Conservatives, the people who were in really rural constituencies, who I wouldn't necessarily say that they think with a protectionist bent in them, but they have rural constituencies where, particularly now when market share, businesses are going under and they're desperate to hold on to whatever business they can have. I think that's going to be a much bigger issue than it would have been before coronavirus, the outbreak began. On the one hand, for Keir Starmer and Labour Party's point, I think this is classical politics for them to get their teeth into, because it's not really, there is more of an argument, I think, for them to wade in and be the party of opposition on some of these issues, as opposed to all the other things pertaining to coronavirus that are really emergency. And this is more linked to the end of transition and bringing a new regime into force. So, I mean, I think it's going to be interesting well, I would say not a post-coronavirus world, but certainly in a COVID world, to have a situation where, on the one hand, we've said that we want to not follow EU tariffs and certain other rules pertaining to trade because we want to be able to do things differently. The question, I think, rapidly becomes, are we going to end up doing things differently, not because we didn't always want to, but because coronavirus ends up forcing the hand of governments, including our own, to say, no, we need to have a more balanced approach. We can't just do the sort of cutting tariffs to the bone. We need to protect our agricultural producers. I think that actually, not so much that it's an excuse, but I think the coronavirus and the COVID episode is actually going to make it a little bit harder to be as buccaneering on trade with global Britain because of the domestic pressures and business going under.
Mm. James, I mean, we've also had this week the publication of the UK's revised tariff schedule, global tariff schedule. I know you've been doing some work on this. So, I mean, some of the headline figures, around 30 billion of tariff duties looking to be removed. And I think 47% of goods coming into the UK at the moment have tariffs. That's looking to 60, looking to make it 47. What are businesses, how are they reacting to what's happened on the tariffs?
I mean, I think, so caveated by the fact that I've not looked through, all the individual tariff lines and, there's the different sectors that might be affected. I think
we'll forgive you for that.
Don't think anyone has.
No. But I think, the initial reaction was it seemed pretty sensible. I think the reduction in tariffs that we've seen, they're for goods that, from what I've seen so far, they don't seem to be things that are going to be threatening domestic producers. I think DIT's done a pretty good job in terms of the research there from an initial look, and in terms of things like removal of nuisance tariffs, which is quite a big thing for small businesses, we'd have to pay them. That seems eminently sensible. We supported that strongly at FSB. The idea that when it costs more to collect a tariff than it does to actually pays out in taxation, it seems really, really a good thing that those have gone. The reaction has been positive. We do a bit more work on it, working with our members now to double check, because you need to make sure that's all right before January 21 comes around. But reaction has been positive so far.
And how do the two of you think that people working in public affairs or in organisations, maybe some of the ones that you have as members, how can they engage effectively in the process of something like the trade bill, or when the government is looking to make more concrete some aspects of its trade policies?
So I think right now we're at a pretty crucial time where a lot of the policy changes inevitably linked to the end of the transition period are coming much more into focus now. And it may seem a lot for businesses to grapple with, particularly without the clear detail of exactly what the changes are going to look like. We have some of it in respect of the immigration system. We know that's changing unilaterally, but when it comes to trade, particularly, I think a lot of businesses, while there are going to be a lot who are looking at a US trade agreement, for example, and seeing where they benefit, the focus after coronavirus when it comes to trade is generally speaking on the EU, simply because changes arising from the EU trade agreement are going to be unlike naturally any other, and they are not going to be the most liberalizing you have ever seen. They are going to inevitably, the government's been clear about that, there are going to be changes, there are going to be new costs. And I think the question then becomes, how do you make sure that you get the message across that, business can only do so much, and I think that's certainly an important message that needs to be delivered to not only this government, but governments around the world. We've seen, for example, there have been, even in the US, where the NAFTA agreement has been renegotiated. It's now called USMCA. While some people would argue that parts of it are actually deliberalizing, generally speaking, it's an FTA aimed at facilitating further trade rather than being the new step after EU membership. So if you look at that, there's actually a lot of pressure that the administration is coming under from businesses to, even for that change, not bring it in the summer because of everything that they're coping with. So I think it's really important for people, and in this sort of position in public affairs, businesses themselves, to not so much take the time that they may have now to work through these problems, but to, on the one hand, see there's a lot of discussion around, can you make efficiencies in your supply chains? Well, when it comes to how we talk to business, on the one hand, we're saying, you know, if you are making those efficiencies in the supply chain now and you're looking at it properly because you've never actually had to look at it and you're having to make adjustments, this might be the time to also think about further down the line what those changes might mean for you. But also conversely, we have to say to government, it's not that we aren't trying to prepare our members, but we need to have much more detail to be able to do that. And I think, you know, for us, the interaction that I have with our members on a daily basis to understand far beyond a survey what is changing on a day-to-day basis, that's really important for government to get access to from those business groups.
And James, how are your members viewing the UK's negotiations with other third countries, or what are they looking for in terms of opportunities from a trade agreement with, for example, the US, or what risks might they see with some agreements as well?
Yeah, so I think there's a lot of, you know, amidst, you know, all the changes that we've seen over the past year plus, you know, 2 years plus, I think there is a lot of, you know, optimism and recognition of the opportunity that there is in the UK's independent trade policy, especially among small businesses that are already trading or considering, you know, exporting as a potential thing that they could do. And then, you know, the US is a major market. It's a major market already. About 1 in 10 of FSB's entire membership, about half of our exporters trade with the US already, and they've identified it in our surveys as the most important single market outside of the EU over the next 3 years. So I think there's a real appetite for, you know, something to be done. You know, the US talks are a challenge. You know, they're not going to be easy, but I think it is felt that there's, you know, things that can be done in things like services and digital in particular. You know, there's a lot of interest there. On goods, you know, goods trade with the US is already pretty good, but there's some things on things like customs facilitation that could be done that I think could really benefit small businesses exporting into the US. You know, small businesses that perhaps, you know, you're not talking about firms that have large, you know, export departments or legal departments. You know, you're talking about usually, if it's not a one-man band, you know, the average size of the members in the businesses in our membership is about 7 employees. So anything that can make it easier for them in terms of paperwork, you know, in terms of, you know, potential weight for their shipments in port, that's all really positive. And I think the feeling is, you know, it's early days, but, you know, the feeling at the moment is something can be done. I think there is a bit of optimism in the air regarding the US. And then looking further afield, I mean, you know, we're expecting the government to publish objectives for Australia and New Zealand at some point soon. Those are 2 markets that our members are very interested in as well. So yeah, there's a lot that can be done that I think can deliver for small businesses.
And both
Can
of
I
you
follow up on that, John?
course.
Is that okay? Yeah, no, I just wanted to follow up on the US point, and also on we sort of mentioned earlier on the global tariff, the nuisance tariffs issue. And I think with the US, it's important for the government and for people just really in the public discourse around it. I mean, I don't think we should pretend that it's not a contentious issue politically within the UK, but sometimes there's too much focus on the politics and not enough on, you know, what is the trade dimension here. And we found it really important to situate whether it's negotiations themselves with the US in a wider framework of what does improving trade with the US look like, where do we want to do it, and for what purposes. And so what we've been looking at doing is actually looking at that in a broader context. So we looked at this sort of digital issue and trade and services that was mentioned, and we basically sort of put together a number of proposals that effectively says, you know, if you can do some of this in a trade agreement, that's great, but we don't want that to be the end of the story. Because at the end of the day, I think there's a lot of political focus on trade negotiations and sometimes not enough on how do you get businesses to actually use them. That's been a huge issue. You know, I've had a business say to me that the only time his organization ever made use of a trade agreement, it was an investment agreement in the end, was when they needed to sue someone. That's the only time that they had made use of an agreement. And so I think, you know, I don't think we're expecting that the language is going to change dramatically, but in terms of making it user friendly. And I think, just to follow up James's point on the trade facilitation point, that's really, really important. I think trade facilitation has gotten a, not so much a bad name, but in the last couple of years, I think because it's been appended to the discussion about the Irish border, it's become quite a politicized issue, when in fact it's very, very important for trade across the world. Even, when it comes to trade movements of goods between parts of the United Kingdom, trade facilitation always really matters. And that can cut the costs of the goods significantly, and delivery times. And it's not always the really exciting political stuff that you hear about in the news, but it's the stuff that's going to actually make the biggest difference for businesses. And so we really want to get the message out there that, just because it might seem less boring, that's actually very often the boring parts of trade agreements are really the nuts and bolts of what matter for business to actually bring down the costs of trade. Because as James said, we already do a lot of trade with the US. In some areas, they're very closed off because of whether it's in public procurement to boost domestic producers, but in other areas, they're fairly open. And so a lot of it becomes, because we do so much trade with the US, I think a lot of the discussion becomes about how do we actually cut the cost of doing that trade, rather than just how do I break into that market. Although I would say that the US can, if you don't know it, be a fairly daunting market because it's fragmented into lots of different state jurisdictions where the rules aren't always the same. It can be a little bit daunting for a non-US firm looking at it. So between the trade agreement and the wider context that we'd like to see, I think both sides situate the negotiations in, because regardless of what happens with political developments and elections, we want these things to be long lasting. So I think that's why it's really important to put it in a wider framework rather than just focus on the negotiations themselves, because I think the focus tends to be on the political and not enough on the actual bread and butter issues for business.
And then both of you spend a lot of time watching what's happening with Brexit negotiations, or on the EU side of things. So before we sort of turn to Brexit in total, how do you get the sense that the EU is viewing what's going on? Some of the things we've talked about, so the UK's global tariff schedule, its negotiations or draft text regarding FTAs. Maybe James, do you want to kick us off on that one?
So, I mean, in terms of the global tariff regime, it won't go without notice in Brussels that, the UK is liberalised. I think that will be now being discussed quite heavily by different member states. I think they'll also be wondering, I think, how that will work with Northern Ireland, because there's a lot of tension in Brussels on the implementation of the Northern Ireland Protocol. With regards to our negotiations elsewhere, I know there's a lot of nervousness in Brussels regarding the negotiations with the US. I think there are, whether they're fair or not, there are fears that the UK will, sign some quick deal with the US that makes it difficult to sign something with the EU. I don't know whether that's true or not personally, but there is that fear there. When I talk to colleagues from counterpart organisations based out of the Netherlands, Germany, and so on, that's one of the things they mention. With regards to places like Australia and New Zealand, I think there's a bit of a, sense of a race being on in Brussels, because obviously the EU's got their own negotiations ongoing, and I think there's three parties all watching the other to see what is going to be negotiated, and then it will be informing their own negotiations. So Brussels is watching with interest. They're reading our news, they're following all the developments here. I'm meeting with the embassies in London to talk about negotiation FTAs that aren't just the EU FTA. They're following it very closely, and it's all to do with the what's going into the future relationship. It's interesting that the UK and Japan have launched their talks now. That actually happened a bit quicker than I was expecting. It's interesting that Japan has gone into that, but they were previously waiting to see what the relationship between the UK and EU would be. So it's interesting those talks are now taking place. And it'll be interesting to see what Japan want to get out of them. There's talk of automotive being a big driver for them. But yeah, the EU are watching closely is the simple answer.
And I think the intersection of the UK's new global tariff with these negotiations shouldn't be underestimated. I mean, it's hard to know without being in government exactly what drove the decisions, because I think actually there were some people who were expecting more radical action on some of the tariffs. as a very small example, but I think a microcosm of what this is all about. You look at something like there were citrus, there was no tariffs on citrus in the temporary tariff regime, and now they're back on. Well, do you say, is that because I heard it jokingly referred to as someone said the marmalade lobby has managed to extract what it wants? I'm not sure it's that simple. I think that there are also implications for, James mentioned the interplay with the Northern Ireland question, and this is the issue, I think, about nuisance tariffs in the immediate sense. I think when the temporary tariff regime was published last April or last March, I think, and it was before the change in government here in the UK. There was no prospect of having to worry about what was this going to do to tariffs going into Northern Ireland and then into that circle had yet to be squared, but it wasn't clear that we were going to have this quandary over does the EU think that the products that you are coming into its market via Ireland are they at risk of going into the single market, or will they stay in the UK once they cross into Northern Ireland from GB? And so when you think about the nuisance tariff issue, you start to think, well, does each, some of the nuisance tariffs, some have been scrapped, some have been just very, very minorly tweaked. And, you want to just hope and make sure that that tweak doesn't end up becoming a thorn in the negotiations on that protocol. It's important to be mindful of the fact that anything that you do now on your unilateral tariff regime potentially has implications for negotiations that we're embarking on now. Understanding how that interplay works, particularly with the complication of the uncertainty over exactly how that protocol on tariffs and customs for trade between Great Britain and Northern Ireland is going to work, it just throws up a lot of questions. And so I think there's a need to make sure that, all industries stay consulted all the way through. Because, I think it's important for people in public affairs and in trade bodies to think about, and in the government. I think the UK, regardless of what one's personal view may be on the alignment or divergence debate, now has control over its tariffs, full control over its tariffs again, or will do at the end of the transition period. And the question is that, what do you use that for? Do you do things so differently from the EU that it becomes its own political dividing issue within the UK? Do we end up seeing trade become a political tool for debate in the way that we've seen in America? Will that change with future elections? Will that change here? And I think that's why it's just really important for people who are, I think, making the case, and for the government and for businesses who are making the case for, using this newfound control to liberalize, to make sure they do it in a transparent, consultative way. As the way I see it is the UK has an opportunity to do things differently now that it has that control. And part of that is actually, I think, learning the lessons from other countries where sometimes the transparency and openness isn't so great. On the other hand, and so last thing I'll say on that, you don't want to end up necessarily in a situation in some other countries where negotiators are entirely beholden to individual industrial interests. And I think that, as someone working for a business group, you can say that, because that's not what you want to see either. You want to see a balance of consumer and business interests taken into account.
And then finally, we touched on this slightly earlier on, but I was, as everyone's talking about coronavirus, I was interested in the two of your views on how what's happening might have changed the views of politicians, or indeed of businesses, when it comes to trade, be that supply chains or how global one wants to be that security of supplies. Do you have any thoughts on that? Or can you tell us what your members are discussing on these matters?
So I think the big thing for businesses, and then also governments, is digital trade. So that's something that was getting a lot of attention beforehand, but I think coronavirus and the realities of the COVID pandemic is only going to heighten. So FSB, we've done a lot of work, for instance, at the WTO, which despite all the headlines, are still engaged in fairly constructive negotiations on an e-commerce agreement, and that's looking at things like removing data localization to make your use of things like cloud computing cheaper. It's looking at things like how do you make different data protection regimes work together. It's looking at things like, use of electronic signatures for in the sense of trade facilitation. All of these things have really been put into focus by COVID. So, we've been talking to members who normally, to complete all their export and import documentation, they need a wet ink signature, and they normally would, that requires a lot of physical interaction with other people. So actually, digitalizing that permanently, I think would be a really positive thing. And I think that's, it was on the radar before, but it's, writ large now. In services, we've seen a lot of people, service providers across borders, transition to delivery via online tools, as they most of the time cannot travel to their customer. And that kind of activity, I think, is going to need to be supported and understood better. And that's where things like, data protection and data localization comes in. So that's been, I think, one of the interesting things. As with most crises, I think crises accelerate existing trends, and those trends were there. But I think this could be the thing that tips it over into becoming a reality, we hope.
Yeah, just to follow up on that, I mean, I think there's sort of several factors to think about here. One is, does that change the whole sort of dynamic between, do you shun globalization? And it's the most extreme form of debate. Do you shun globalization and globalism in favor of purely domestic supply chains? And the tendency obviously is there because of the arguments out there in the political ether, and this is where politics and economics and trade become very bound up very, very quickly, is over, how are you going to work your way out of the crisis? Because a lot of people are saying at the boundaries of some of this debate, not necessarily people who spend a lot of time on the details, well, it's just as simple as repatriating supply chains back away from Asia, away from China. And I think that there's some lessons to be learned, even from what's going on now, as to why going 180 degrees in the opposite direction is not a good idea. And if you look actually at the US has a very domestic supply chain. It's very, I wouldn't say localized, but it's not very international. We import a lot more of our food and from outside of the UK. And while some people might see, whether you want to call that reliance, dependence, or exposure to imports as a weakness, you can very easily look at the US for how that turns into a weakness if you have too much production just in one country, because effectively a lot of their meat processing plants have had to completely shut down because of some of the outbreaks. And while it's by no means the sole reason, I think the UK having a more diverse source of where it gets its produce and supplies from is actually a good thing. Now, you can say, you can also have in the other direction where you are too dependent on one source and one single source country for your materials, particularly if they're large scale orders. So we are seeing people start to, about sort of 1 in 10 members have said they're starting to diversify their supply chains. We don't know quite where they are yet to. Things are changing on the ground very, very quickly for businesses on trade on a day-to-day basis. Think about as production now finally comes back, air cargo costs start to go down because you're not having all this delay on getting shipments of PPE out from places in Asia to the UK, for example. But the last thing I wanted to bring up on that is I think it'll be a really interesting argument in the UK. I mean, we've sort of effectively, I think the government has made its choice that it doesn't want to do any kind of regulatory or any other kind of alignment with the EU as part of its future relationship. So in a way, the argument is sort of maybe null and void, but I do think it's worth actually reflecting on whether, I would say that even for my own self, my personal views on, how important it is to keep some kind of tariff alignment with the EU to avoid rules of origin on manufactured products that have lots of different component parts. The context being that if you stayed aligned with some of the EU tariffs on this, you could avoid having to prove where all your components are coming from. And I think actually the arguments, around tariff alignment, customs union are different now. I think coronavirus has changed that to an extent in respect of, yes, you still don't want to get into a situation where you're sort of doing tit for tat with your nearest regional market. But on the other hand, you do want a little bit more flexibility to respond. And I think that we've seen that actually, maybe not quite yet on a trade front, but even on something as seemingly pedantic as a piece of EU competition law, it's become an issue for banks getting loans here in the UK now. And you start to think, well, maybe in some areas, it really would be better for the UK to be able to act more quickly and more responsibly in certain areas. In other ones, I think the alignment argument or trying to do things more collectively, particularly around science and technology, I think that our debate will continue to rage. But it's interesting, I think, that the COVID outbreak and the pandemic has slightly shifted the dynamics to more balanced, I think, output on where we get to on, is it worth staying in lockstep with the EU if you cannot get your particularities listened to when those decisions are being made in some key fundamental areas? And I think on tariffs, that's actually increasingly one of them.
I think it's interesting that the COVID pandemic, in terms of the trade policy response, quietly you've seen the UK kind of working with the EU. So on things like, you know, pushing for removal of trade restrictions on PPE, you know, stuff like work on tariffs on medical products. You know, it's not been, you know, there's been no big announcements, but if you look at what the UK is doing, what the EU is doing, coordinated via the G20, it's been quite positive, actually. I'd say quite sensible. So if we can see a bit more of that, even despite, you know, Brexit and the future relationship, you know, that I think that'll be a real positive.
Yeah, I think it's going to be really interesting to see what, and we, you know, I think people within government, outside of government should be thinking about that now. What does cooperation after this, you know, it is a very politically contentious topic about, you know, how long we have these negotiations. But if you park that, if it's entirely possible just for a minute, you start to think about, well, you know, the relationship that we're going to have with the EU is forever. And so it's probably going to be an iterative process anyways. I doubt we're going to get everything into, particularly if we need to get a deal done by the end of the year, into this round. On the one hand, that's not absolutely wonderful for businesses who might be particularly exposed to lots of repeat or sort of consequential changes and trade arrangements. But on the other hand, I think it actually, you know, it will help allow us to get to a place where we are thinking about what does coordination, cooperation with the EU, outside of the EU look like, and what should it look like. And I think, you know, the more we get to that position of thinking, the better. Because there are a lot of synergies. You know, it was interesting, just on one last small, almost amusing point on that front, you know, it was almost ironic that the UK and the EU, when they effectively, for lack of a better phrase, ganged up together and decided to divvy up their, you know, tariff rate quotas, they had several members of the WTO very unhappy with them, but the UK and the EU were effectively in lockstep. So it'd be interesting to see what else they end up as quote unquote sovereign independent equals, to use the UK chief negotiator's turn of phrase, what that cooperation and coordination in a post-Brexit setting actually looks like.
Fantastic. We'll have to get back together in 2021 and see if what we've talked about comes to pass. Anyway, thank you very much to Ali Radisson and to James Sibley for joining us, and thank you for watching.